just got to know her through email. A colleague said she works on post-colonial. She wants to work on post-colonial feminism. So I just said she must come and hear you.
The UN colleague?
No, just in So this is the person you had to meet. You met her before.
What for here and not what twice?
When this is
Oh, okay. Sorry.
I really think this is good about my appreciation
Oh, don't worry about it.
This is about no bathroom. You have to pay for it. Allá atrás están los equipos de traducción para quienes gusten de audífonos y para traducción simultánea. Ustedes son los que tienen que preocuparse por entender. Yo no, mentira, una cosa rara. Y de acuerdo como te vayas dando cuenta. Exacto. Y ya pues voy viendo todo ahí. Papeles a la vez. Pero no.
A ver, lo abres.
Pero ya todos tienen. No en la tarde.
this will do the translation.
Yeah, I think it's better because, well, I speak English, but
Yes.
to understand, in a level. In fact, to learn from you.
Oh, no.
That's the real thing, I guess. I'm so glad to be here. Well, both of us are so.
No, I'm so glad to get a chance to meet you. It's so wonderful. And because gender is not a very popular field anymore. It's in a ghetto.
Yeah.
People.
It was a little politicized 10 years ago, I guess. At least it makes sense.
Yeah, in India also. And now not so much.
I think it's necessary now to do something with the category of gender. There are a lot of students, I have a lot of students here in them trying to do things with women, at least.
Ah, nice.
A lot of people. In a lot of matters, in crime, in justice, in politics. Not necessarily things about gender, but things about women. And I guess that's a kind of a door to get in
To gender.
to gender reflection, I guess. And
Yeah.
it's very difficult to the students, at least in the youngest ones, to make a profound reflection on gender. It's very difficult. I guess for me also.
Empecemos de una vez. Tenemos nuevos micrófonos, ¿sí te diste cuenta? Estamos estrenando. Buenos días. Vamos a dar inicio a la sesión titulada Debates historiográficos. En este coloquio, Reflexiones sobre la India, Política Contemporánea e Historiografía. El formato que vamos a utilizar es el siguiente. Tenemos 3 conferencias para el día de hoy. La primera a cargo de la doctora Mrinalini Sinha, la segunda a cargo del doctor Saurabh Dubey y la tercera en la tarde a cargo del doctor Sanjay Subramanyam. Y cada uno de los conferenciantes estará en la mesa con 2 colegas de nuestro instituto para poder iniciar un diálogo, un intercambio de ideas, porque finalmente el objetivo de este evento es conocer el tipo de trabajo, el tipo de reflexiones historiográficas que están guiando la investigación de colegas que están trabajando sobre la India. Entonces, sin más preámbulo, quiero presentarles a Mrinalini Sinha. Ella se doctoró en el Departamento de Historia en la Universidad de Nueva York en 1988. Actualmente es Alice Freeman Palmer Professor en el Departamento de Historia de la Universidad de Michigan y es presidente de la Asociación de Estudios, presidente de la Asociación de Estudios Asiáticos. En el 2012 obtuvo la beca John Guggenheim. Sus áreas de investigación son historia moderna de Asia, historia colonial de la India, estudios de género. Entre sus trabajos más recientes tenemos el libro publicado en el 98 titulado Colonial Masculinity, The Manly Englishman and the Effeminate Bengali in the Late 19th Century. Es del 98, se reimprimió en el 2003, y el otro libro que tiene la doctora Sinha del 2006, Spectres of Modern India, the Global Restructuring of an Empire, publicado por Duke University Press en el 2006. Le agradecemos la presencia, que haya aceptado nuestra invitación. Para quienes necesitan el equipo para la traducción simultánea, en la parte de atrás pueden pasar, por favor, y te escuchamos.
Thank you. Gracias. Thank you, Professor Molino. Okay. Thank you, Professor Molino, Marta, Elisa, thank you very much. And I'd really like to thank the Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas for inviting me and for the very, very warm hospitality that I have had since I've been here. Also like to thank Professors Banerjee and Dubey for their hospitality as well. Es un honor estar aquí, and that is unfortunately the limit of my Spanish. So I am going to apologize for having to talk to you in English. I did study Spanish, but I unfortunately do not remember enough to be able to do this talk in Spanish. So please forgive me for being very American and using English. In 1986, there was a book that was published called Feminism and Nationalism in the Third World by a Sri Lankan scholar, Kumari Jayawardena. And in many ways, this book really marked the opening of scholarship on gender and nationalism. Before then, most feminist scholarship, especially in the Anglo-American Academy, did not consider nationalism as a subject of study. So feminist scholars thought, very much like the early 20th century feminist Virginia Woolf, that a woman had no country, a woman needs no country, and the only country that a woman has is the whole world. So much feminist scholarship in the West had completely ignored the study of nationalism. And so Jayawardena focused And in fact, what I want to address today is a real paradox. That sitting here in 2015, I would say that South Asian feminist scholarship has now become very acceptable in the mainstream of South Asian scholarship. So feminist scholars have a seat now on the main table. There is at least lip service to the scholarship by feminist scholars, by gender scholars. But this lip service is actually quite superficial. There is very little sustained and detailed in-depth engagement with the kind of work that's been done on gender and by feminist scholars. The relationship between feminist scholarship and mainstream South Asian historiography, I think, could be considered one of benign neglect, that they both kind of follow different paths. So many of the major cruxes or debates in South Asian historiography have often not taken into account the work that has been done by feminist scholarship. Now I want to focus on the scholarship on gender and nationalism to reflect on this kind of uneven relationship that partly because the study of nationalism itself has been so successful in incorporating gender, I think it may be useful to see, by looking at that scholarship on nationalism, why the relationship between feminist scholarship and mainstream South Asian historiography has been so uneven, and what can be done to kind of make feminist scholarship and gender scholarship be more cutting edge, be more open to a broader incorporation into the field. Let me start with some kind of broad definitions with which I will proceed. When I'm talking about nationalism here and the scholarship on nationalism, I'm referring mainly to scholarship on anti-colonial nationalism in India, because that's the area where I think the impact of gender scholarship has been the greatest. But of course, even anti-colonial mainstream nationalism in India was never one thing. It had different political, spatio-temporal coordinates. There were different communities that constituted their nationalism differently. But in talking about nationalism very broadly, my aim is not to flatten that diversity of nationalisms, but I think we can still say some general things about what we have learned from the scholarship on gender and nationalism and how it has transformed in this particular area the subject of study itself, that of nationalism. What do I mean by gender? And again, very briefly, I have a sort of two-part definition that some of you might be familiar with. It comes from the scholar Joan Scott, who made an argument about looking at gender as an important analytical category. And she talks about gender as both a constituent element of social relationships that are based on sex differences. So when we think of social relationships based on sex differences, that was one definition of gender. But I think her further contribution was to argue that gender is not just that, but gender is also the means through which various relationships of power, not just between men and women, are both articulated and consolidated. And it is this expanded definition of gender, both as perceived sex differences as well as a means for articulating other relations of power, not necessarily between men and women. It's this expanded definition that has made possible the rethinking of what nationalism has been in the scholarship, at least since the 1980s. So I'm not talking about adding women to the scholarship on nationalism. There was a lot of very good scholarship in the past, both academic and popular, that brought the contribution of women to nationalism. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this expanded understanding of nationalism through gender, which I argue has been able to change or expand our very understanding of what is political, if nationalism is seen as a political movement. There are three ways in which I think the scholarship on gender and nationalism has expanded the way in which we understand what is political history or what is political. Two of these three ways that I'll talk about first, I think have been much more developed in the scholarship. And I'll kind of briefly touch upon what their contributions have been, as well as what their limitations are, which results in this uneven relationship between feminist scholarship and South Asian historiography. The last part, I think, is just an emerging movement, and I will talk about that in my conclusion. And I will also suggest that perhaps that is one way of addressing why gender and feminist scholarship has remained or has enjoyed a very uneven success in fully integrating itself into the larger debates and cruxes in South Asian historiography. So let's look at the first way in which I think gender has made an important contribution to expanding our understanding of what is political history or what is politics in the South Asian context. The first point has been the kind of bringing together of the domestic with the political, or the politicizing of the domestic. And I think that has been a very important contribution of gendered scholarship. It has done this bringing together, the aligning of the domestic with the political, the politicizing of the domestic, through, I think, three very important ways. First, I think it's allowed us to see that what we consider the domestic, the private, the family, has not always been that way. That the family has been privatized at particular moments in history. So a lot of the scholarship, especially on early modern, pre-colonial India, has shown us that the family or the household was very closely tied to public, political, and economic processes. The most important example, or the most obvious example, is the ways in which the family was the locus for securing dynastic succession. It was often the way of kind of framing the forms of governance. So when the family became private, it was not natural, it was not ancient. The privatizing of the family was very associated with certain practices of the colonial state in India and the responses of indigenous elites. So we begin to see that when we think of that separation of the political and the public and the private, that far from being natural has a very particular history. And there were particular reasons why, because of which the earlier form of household, the more publicly embedded household, was gradually privatized, and how in the colonial period we see movements to create this new privatized family that is supposedly kept out of larger political and economic processes. A family based much more on the dyad of husband and wife, a kind of nuclear family that was kind of being constituted in ways that would be more amenable to the new kind of property regimes that were being set in place under colonial rule. If we start thinking of the family as the privatizing of the family as a political thing rather than a natural thing, it also leads us to the next kind of set of contributions that scholarship on gender and nationalism has made in the Indian context, and that has been bringing together the relationship between two domains that in colonial India were often seen as separate: the domain of social reform of caste, of religion, of gender issues that were often seen as separate from national political anti-colonial agitation. So much so that in the colonial context they had two separate organizations responsible for that. So you had a party called the Indian National Congress that was an umbrella organization for anti-colonial agitation, and the National Social Conference, which was involved with thinking about changes in caste reform, in gender reform, as well as various religious reforms. But our scholarship on social reform movements has shown us that the separation between political and social was really very impossible to make. They were very, very closely tied together. The most famous example from the South Asian context has been the recognition of the ways in which the Indian elites, Indian middle class and elites, focused during the colonial period on the women's question, the problem of the situation of women, and often they did so over that of caste reform or other kinds of reform. And in doing so, they were betraying in some ways their particular caste and class background. But I think the other thing that the focus on women's question has shown us is that the women's question was very seldom about women themselves. It was often a debate about indigenous culture, indigenous tradition. It was about class formation. It was really very seldom about women. Women were often the excuses through which these other issues were debated. We also see the importance of social reform for political context, especially nationalism, when we look at the arena in which social reform happened in colonial India. The British state had kind of put certain issues that dealt with issues of marriage, of divorce, of inheritance, under what were called religious personal laws. And these religious personal laws were things from which the colonial state kind of abdicated full responsibility. It would interfere only when it felt that they were going against what they considered broader humanistic ideas. In this context of separate personal laws, we see that social reform, the way it developed in India, really was about creating and consolidating homogeneous religious communities. So we see through various kinds of reforms on widow remarriage, on divorce legislations, that in effect what these legislations were doing is that they were trying to uniform provide a homogeneous, uniform Hindu law, Muslim law. Of course, there were challenges to this homogeneous process from various different communities, various caste groups, but the end result of all of these reforms were actually to produce these competing communities. And often social reform ended up becoming a kind of competitive game between the various communities in reforming and disciplining their particular women in their communities. So why does this have to do with nationalism? It does because it provides the kind of community and the kind of nation on behalf of which nationalism would articulate itself. And so unless we kind of bring that social reform material within the study of nationalism, it would be very hard to think of what that community is on behalf of which national claims are being made. But I think the third way in which this politicization of the domestic happens is perhaps the most well-known and maybe the most important. And that is the way in which the politicization of the domestic, or the aligning of the domestic with the political, has allowed us to understand the very nature of anti-colonial nationalism as a different kind of nationalism than nationalisms that were not anti-colonial in their orientation. And I think there are two sort of related and interesting arguments here that are worthy of consideration. The first is the way in which in the early public sphere in India, many of the debates in newspapers, in the print culture more broadly, in books, plays, tracts, many of the debates were debates around issues from the domestic sphere that had spilled over to the public sphere. Issues about adulterous wives who were murdered by their husbands, or about how women run their house. These were major debates in the public sphere. And a lot of scholars have argued that it is in these debates that liberal political reformers really started building their strategies, their ideas, their arguments that they would later use in anti-colonial agitation. Many of them, especially towards the latter half of the 19th century, would also see this domestic sphere as a kind of, as one scholar has called it, a compensation for their loss of control or autonomy with the colonial state in other parts of their lives. So women's situation became something now that they controlled. So in the 19th century, you got people making arguments for defending certain kind of practices, which could even lead to the death of child wives. And in this particular case, it did by having premature sexual intercourse with women, and in a number of cases where these young child brides died. a nationalist argument was made for continuing that practice on the grounds that that was something that the community should control by itself and not have the colonial state intervene. Now, this was not always the case, but you see here then the shift that would be very ironic to make an argument for liberty, for freedom for men on the grounds of this kind of assault on women. And you see very soon the argument shifts away from wives, you know, the position of wives, to this kind of glorification of the mother, which made this compatibility between arguing for freedom and disciplining women a little easier. The one that's perhaps the most widely cited in terms of understanding the nature of anti-colonial nationalism is perhaps the argument made by Partha Chatterjee, and in part because it's so schematic and simple, it has been used as a model for understanding nationalisms in many parts of the world. I think there have been very important and useful critiques of that argument, but I think there's something to his point, the general argument, which is still worthy of recovering, where he looks at this distinction that nationalists often made between an inner or spiritual sphere and an outer or political sphere as a way of finding a possibility to be both Indian and to be modern, so that they could make changes for the gender relations on their own and claim that that was a particularly Indian thing, but they could also claim to be modern in kind of copying the West in certain other things, like in politics or the economy and statecraft more broadly. So he's arguing that it is an epistemological deficit of Indian nationalism because it's derivative, it's behind European nationalism, that it has this dilemma of both copying it but also being different. And he says that in some ways this relationship between the outer sphere and inner sphere allows Indian nationalism to both make a claim that it's different and that it is modern. And we can talk about some of the criticisms of this position later, but I think the important point is that he is using a gendered analysis here, where the position of women in the inner sphere, spiritual sphere, becomes very critical for understanding how Indian nationalism was actually a very different kind of nationalism than the one more familiar with scholars like Benedict Anderson and others who kind of spoken of a modular form of nationalism that was prevalent in different parts of the world. If I had to think of the contribution of this wing, this first wing of the contribution of gendered nationalism, the alignment of the domestic with the political or the privatization of the political, I think the most important contribution it's made is to make us aware of the fact that gender reform, gender relations was always a public political project, that it was not just a project about the private or the domestic or about men and women. It was always tied to larger community political projects. We see that most obviously when we think of Gandhi and Gandhian nationalism in India, with its concern for the quotidian or for the daily life, how that was so much part of the nationalist movement. But we also see it in various other kinds of movements, in caste reform, anti-caste movements like the self-respect movement in South India, where the kind of self-respect that this non-Brahmin community kind of constituted itself through was through creating these self-respect marriages that were formed without any religious rituals and traditions. We see that even in the lowest caste, like Dalit or untouchable caste movements in India, where the focus of community mobilization was often reform of marriage, of women, and of the family. So it makes very clear to us that issues of gender, issues of women's reforms have always been part of larger political projects and community mobilizations. But I think this wing of scholarship, useful though it has been, has some major problems. One of the problems I think it has is that it has sort of reinforced the idea that gender analysis really belongs in the domestic, in the private, in the family, in the home. So it's kind of helped equate gender analysis with the domestic, even though it's also trying to bring the domestic into the political. The second kind of limitation of the scholarship has been that for it, women's issues and women's question is often a symbol or an object. It's a symbol for a community. It's a symbol for the nation. But it itself is never the subject of the debate. And I think both of these weaknesses has kind of limited the way in which feminist scholarship on gender has been able to talk more broadly to questions beyond that has traditionally concerned feminist scholars so far. So despite the kind of break with the scholarship of nationalism in embracing gender analysis, even if it doesn't always embrace feminist contributions, has been useful but also limiting, I think, in the long run because of the association of gender with domestic and the focus on women merely as symbols or objects of national reform rather than as subjects themselves. So let me move then to the second contribution, which I think is a different and an equally important one, which is the gendering of the public. So if in the first we saw the domestic being politicized, I think in the second we moved to kind of thinking about how the public political sphere is gendered. And I think this has been particularly useful in bringing into focus not just women as gendered beings, but also men as gendered beings. And this has taken various forms, and again, I think there are three sort of ways in which this has been particularly useful. First has been just the gendered representation of the nation. You know, why do nations get constituted as motherland, as mother? And this has been very dominant in the South Asian context with the idea of Bharat Mata or Mother India as the most kind of prevalent representation of the nation. Though motherland is not exclusive, other familial imageries are also used. The nation is sometimes also the fatherland. So for Hindu nationalists in 20th century India, the nation was both Matrabhumi or motherland, but also Pitrubhumi or fatherland. So you could have, both the idea of male or female representation of the nation. But I think some of the scholarship on this representation, the representational work that gender does for the nation, has been useful in showing us a couple of things. It's been useful in showing us how the idea of nationalism acquires affect, or how we actually kind of feel for it, our emotion for it, how it insinuates itself into our daily lives. And I think that's been useful to think about this not just as a political project, but a defense of a motherland, of a fatherland. It's also raised for us the question that if the nation is a mother or a father, how do actually gendered male and female respond to it differently? So that's been another very useful opening that this representational scholarship has done. And third, I think it's also allowed us to think of the ways in which both the nation which is being constructed and this new gender binary, around a nuclear family with a male and a female, women at home, men in the world, how both of them are being constructed and legitimated or naturalized by borrowing from each other. So the nation helps make the male-female binary natural, and the male-female binary helps make the nation natural. In the scholarship in India, we also see another way in which the gendering of the public has been useful, and that is by drawing attention to how a lot of the politics of the nation or of communities have centered around ideas of emasculation, male emasculation under colonial rule. In my own work, but other scholarship as well, we see how a particular class, so a middle class, can take a stereotype that was foisted on them by the British of being less manly, of being effeminate, they can use that to kind of make their own suffering the suffering of the nation, to make it seem as if that is, they are representative of the entire nation. Their emasculation is the emasculation of the entire nation. So you get a class and an anti-colonial project happening around that fear of recovering indigenous honor, masculinity from the colonial state. But you also see that in much more virulent forms between different communities. So you see Hindu nationalists kind of use the idea of Muslim rapists about, wanting to abduct or rape, innocent or Hindu women who need to be protected. You have these Hindu nationalists kind of look at certain caste traditions, like Kshatriya traditions, and make that more equated with all Hindus, or taking certain traditional ascetic traditions in Hinduism and using that as a kind of remasculinization project that becomes part of that national move. And here again, I think Gandhi is interesting in kind of resisting in his nationalism this logic of masculinity, of trying to prove that we are as masculine as you, and actually using a number of feminine symbols in kind of thinking about a new gendered opposition to the colonial state. But I think the gendering of the public, perhaps the most useful, the most important work in this direction has been to look at how a discourse of male honor in particular becomes so prevalent in moments of heightened sexual violence that often has accompanied nationalism. And in South Asia, that moment of heightened sexual violence was, of course, during the time of the independence and partition of the state, where women of the other group become people whom they're their women, so those are the women you attack, and your women or our women become women you protect. And you see enormous sexual violence on both the Hindu and Muslim side, on both the frontiers of India that was divided to make the new states of India and Pakistan. And the interesting thing here, by focusing on male honor, is to recognize how much of it had to do really with a discourse or an exchange between men. The women were kind of not the main target, but they were the target, but this was really a dialogue between two groups of men. And I think one particular incident makes that very clear. In the Punjab, where most of this violence happened, the stripping, the branding, the raping, the assaulting of women from each side, one of the things that scholars have found that Dalit or untouchable women, people of the lowest caste, were actually not subject. Normally they're subject to enormous violence from upper caste people, but during the partition violence, they were not subject to the same kind of violence that upper caste women were. And in part, it was because Dalit women, the Dalit men in the community were not people whom you were trying to humiliate by violating their women, because Dalit men were not even considered part of the group with whom you are sort of in this exchange of humiliation. The male honor trope also is very useful to kind of think about the interfamilial violence that happened during partition, which kind of shows us the way in which family violence, national violence, state violence were often in a continuum. So, for example, many women were killed by their own brothers and fathers before they could become victims of sexual violence by the other group. Some women even killed themselves in order to avoid the fate of the sexual violence that was often in store for them. Now, interestingly, the language which the state used, the family used, and the community used was the language that these women sacrificed their honor for the state. Now here, what we're doing, we have no reason or no way to know why women actually killed themselves, but even that act of killing was already taking away from them by describing it as sacrifice, making or naturalizing the male definition of honor as the natural thing to do. So these women were doing it as a sacrifice rather than seeing it as, willful act of self-protection, for example. If I look at the scholarship on gendering the public, I think its biggest contribution has been to make us recognize and see men as well as women as gendered subjects. And I think that's been really useful in paying attention to men and masculinity as well in studying nationalism. The second major contribution, I think, of the scholarship has been to kind of recognize gender analysis, not just something that has to do with the domestic, with the sphere of women, with the private, but really bringing gendered analysis into the larger public or political domain. Where I think this work is often limited is that in its focus on collective representations, whether it is of national honor, whether it is of gendered definitions of the nation, I think it often is less successful in showing how individuals or families respond to these collective scripts. That obviously there's a lot of mediation between that collective script and individuals and families and communities, and how to think about their agency, which kind of both often challenges, goes against, and modifies these collective scripts. So I think that has kind of limited the scope or the potential of this second strand as well in making gender scholarship much more central to broader debates in South Asian historiography. I'm going to turn now to the third. How am I doing with time?
Maybe 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. I'll turn now to the third point that I think is not yet as well developed, but I think has a lot of potential in thinking about not just gender and nationalism, but also perhaps thinking about the larger question with which I started, which was how do we account for the fact that there is tremendous lip service to feminist scholarship, but yet not the kind of detailed, in-depth, sustained engagement with the kind of contributions that have been made possible by that work. So this third is a return in some ways to what perhaps may look in 2015 as old-fashioned, but I hope it's a return in a different way, and return in a more provocative and a radical way, and that is a return to women. So we started with women, gender, and now thinking about return to women and women's agency. There's been very old as well as new scholarship on the participation of women, both elite as well as subaltern women, and in nationalist movements. Some of the scholarship has been very useful. It's made us kind of think about the different spaces in which public politics, nationalist politics happens. For example, women were active not just out in the streets, in political organizations, in demonstrations and riots, but we know of several cases, or many more cases, of women supporting anti-colonial nationalist movements within the home, often against the family, against their husbands, harboring anti-colonial seditionists or extremists, or providing other forms of support. And I think it kind of makes us think about the space in which politics or national politics happens differently by incorporating that domestic space as well as the public as a place for public politics. But I think the more important contribution of women's agency has been the thinking about the relationship between feminism and nationalism. Because in many of the anti-colonial movements we see across the third world, and this is referring back to Jayawardena's classic 1986 study, that nationalists or anti-colonial nationalism both spawned or kind of created an opening for feminist movements by taking on the issues of gender oppression, by taking on the issues of women's public participation, but also often contained that by kind of wanting women's and feminist demands to be framed only within the national demands. So we see a contradictory relationship between that, but I still think that's a very different relationship than the relationship between feminism and the projects of the nation or the projects of the state in the Euro-American world. And it does give us a very kind of strange anomaly, certainly in the case of India, but I think in lots of places across Asia and Africa, where political and legal rights for women at the time of independence often comes very easily. It often comes at the same moment as independence. But the subordination of women at home is often a much harder thing to counter. And I think that is because of this particular history of feminism and nationalism. And I think it already points us in the direction of thinking that perhaps that Euro-American model really does not fit the case of these formerly colonized countries. And I think it leads in some scholars, and I think in some scholarship, very emerging and burgeoning scholarship, in kind of thinking about then the construction of women itself. That how does feminism construct its subject, this woman? Because if you look at feminism and nationalism as tied in the Indian context, we see women are not being constructed as the subject of feminism simply in relationship to men. They're actually being constructed in relationship to communities. So there are Hindu communities, Muslim communities, Christian communities, Sikh communities. If that is the way in which the colonial state interacted with the people, in constructing women, you are going against that collective understanding of the community, and you're constructing woman as the only individual, as the kind of model for this kind of individual citizen of a future nation. And we see that in a series of changes that happened in the 20s and 30s in India. So for example, scholars of Indian politics would be very familiar that in 1931, it was the first time that the Indian nationalist movement made a claim for rights for individual citizens of India, not for Hindus, not for Muslims, but for individual citizens. And that resolution in traditional scholarship is often associated with the influence of communism, with the influence of Marxism, and particularly with M.N. Roy, an Indian communist leader. But feminist scholars have shown that much more important, much more significant in that change, this focus on individual citizens, was this construction of woman as a figure who was cross communities. It was not successful, it was very problematic, it was brief, but women or feminist movements in India constructed women against these notions of class and caste as cutting across these other divisions, which would mean that it would lead this construction of women in always in constant conflict with the construction of the rights for minority communities. And we see the legacy of that in India even today, where rights for women are often seen as against rights for minority communities or for lower caste communities. So in effect, what I'm saying is that if we were to take the idea of the way in which a woman is constructed, a woman comes into being in the politics of India, we would be able to get a different history, a different genealogy of ideas of Indian democracy, of Indian citizenship, of Indian liberalism, because this feminist construct was coming out of a very, very different milieu than the perceived sex differences that we associate with gender and with feminism in the West. So let me conclude. It's obvious that I'm kind of suggesting that gender nationalism is a huge success of the kind of work that feminist scholars have done until now. But it's an uneven success. It's an uneven success for a variety of reasons. First, because the women in the scholarship still remain one-dimensional. It's considered much more fashionable, much better, much more interesting to look at men and masculinity. Women remain flat and one-dimensional as objects, as symbols. Second, I think the domestic sphere has been brought into dialogue with the political, but the domestic has been tremendously flattened in these accounts. We don't get the way in which the dynamics of the domestic are so closely tied with the political. Third, I think women remain in much of the scholarship on gendered nationalism as symbols rather than as actors. As symbols, they kind of are crucial for understanding nationalism, but they very seldom have a role in shaping the new kind of political movement that nationalism would be and would become. Fourth, the traditional political sphere, the sphere of high politics, when we talk about citizenship, when we talk about democracy, when we talk about liberalism, that has remained curiously ungendered. We assume that that's not the sphere of women's participation. So in effect what we have is gender has become the most fashionable buzzword in thinking about nationalism. It has made lots of changes in the way we think about nationalism, that expanded political that I've addressed. But it still has kept that old division of labor, women at home, men in the world, even though we've changed it around, complicated it, added new things to it. But that old binary still, to a large extent, informs the scholarship on gendered nationalism. So what I'm proposing instead is that if we were really to take seriously the kind of history, the particular history of the South Asian context in this case, it should lead us to actually open up the category of women, to really rethink that women is not an a priori thing constituted by sex differences, but women is constituted in the public and in the private in relation to many, many different things. And it's very different to the kind of intersectionality that we see people talk about when they say women plus class, plus race, plus gender. I'm saying that the very category of women itself shows us how open we need to think about when we think about the notion of gender or of women. And what this would allow us to do is perhaps finally get rid of this public and private divide. It would open up gender to completely new meanings, to make us kind of more conscious of what gender means in particular contexts instead of assuming we already know the meaning of gender. And finally, I think it would be another way of making work from the global south, from the former third world, in this case from South Asia, as the way in which we rethink not just South Asian scholarship, but I would argue the scholarship on gender or feminist scholarship at large. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, la doctora Sinha, por su conferencia. Me disculpo porque cuando la presenté olvidé decir el título de la conferencia. Pero ahora vamos a escuchar a nuestras comentaristas, dos queridas colegas, la doctora Elisa Speckman, investigadora de nuestro instituto, experta en historia de la justicia, la criminalidad, y la doctora Marta Santillán, quien actualmente está haciendo un postdoctorado en el Instituto Mora, también trabaja estos temas de criminalidad, y les agradezco que hayan aceptado la invitación para comentar el trabajo de Mrinalini. Entonces, las escuchamos. Marta, por favor.
Bueno, antes que nada quiero agradecer al doctor Andrés Ríos la invitación para estar aquí. Por supuesto me siento muy honrada de estar aquí en el instituto comentando, quizá aprendiendo más que otra cosa de la doctora Sinha aquí junto a mí, lo cual me hace sentir aún más halagada. Muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Y bueno, en realidad, escuchando a la doctora Sinha, me vinieron muchas inquietudes a la cabeza, muchas reflexiones en torno al asunto de la categoría de género. Si bien ciertamente yo estudio criminalidad y cuestiones de transgresiones, también es cierto que me he ocupado de estudiar a las mujeres en estos ámbitos. Y eso, desde que comencé mis estudios, siempre me llevó a encontrarme o a tener que usar la categoría de género. Y siempre fue un poco complejo y complicado, digamos, para mí como estudiante. Y situación que veo que sucede igual con mis ahora estudiantes que hacen tesis sobre cuestiones de mujeres que se tienen que enfrentar al asunto de la categoría de género. Como bien sabemos, la categoría de género ha sido muy debatida en diversos foros académicos a lo largo del mundo. En su momento, hacia los años 90, me parece que fue importante esta discusión, se politizó, por supuesto, y llevado al terreno de la historia, que es de lo que yo puedo hablar, me parece que no deja de ser menos necesaria y pertinente la discusión sobre el uso de esta categoría. Ciertamente, Joan Scott nos abrió como una gran posibilidad para comenzar con el uso de esta categoría dentro de la historia, pero también creo, y esto es más en un asunto más pragmático, a la hora de hacer investigaciones de mujeres con categoría de género, o incluso investigaciones sobre varones con categoría de género, que comienza a complicarse mucho el tema, porque partimos de esta idea binaria precisamente de relaciones de poder en donde las mujeres siempre, aparentemente, terminan, digamos, subsumidas a la masculinidad. Y muchas veces me parece que nos enfrentamos a pensar, sobre todo cuando hacemos historia del siglo XIX, del siglo XX, que las mujeres estaban en una peor situación que ahora, y entonces andamos buscando como esa peor situación que ahora y viendo como en dónde se fueron dando esos cambios, esas coyunturas que nos llevaron a la gloria del cierre del siglo. Y yo creo que aun cuando hagamos historia, no podemos dejar de lado el compromiso de tratar de construir una realidad mucho más compleja a la luz de la categoría de género. Y aquí, digamos, me sumo a la propuesta de la doctora Sinha, por supuesto, quien nos da luces al respecto. Y me parece que al inicio de su conferencia lo que propone es sumamente interesante y creo que no hay que perderlo de vista, y es la necesidad de expandir la categoría de género, que no se quede solo en el terreno de las relaciones de poder, las cuales solo son entre hombres y mujeres, es decir, estas relaciones de poder sean en un terreno más amplio. Y como historiadores bien sabemos que no podemos hacer historia obligando al contexto que estamos estudiando a ceñirse a una categoría. Tenemos que hacerlo justamente al revés, es decir, ciertamente tenemos que pensar que la nación está construido por muchos espacios y entre ellos el género. Y en ese sentido, esto nos obliga a no pensar que el género es una relación binaria donde las mujeres la pasan peor que los hombres, o viceversa, o más o menos. Esto nos exige, esta expansión de la categoría de género, creo que nos está exigiendo, esta propuesta de la doctora Sinha nos está exigiendo pensar que en la arena de lo político y la política, me parece, entendiendo lo político como este ámbito que puede estar entre lo público y lo privado, o en lo público y lo privado a la vez, y que es la arena del conflicto social, y que este conflicto social va a estar atravesado por cuestiones ideológicas, por cuestiones de casta, por cuestiones comunitarias, por cuestiones familiares, pero por cuestiones de género también. Eso nos hace suponer luego entonces que la conformación de una nación, hablando de nuestras naciones aquí en el tercer mundo, entre otras muchas cosas, se va a construir también a la luz de las relaciones de género. Pero unas relaciones de género que tienen que estar más expandidas y más abiertas hacia la arena del conflicto social. Y en esta medida también dar cuenta cómo las naciones o las esferas de gobierno, por decirlo de alguna manera, se consolidan también en determinado tipo de relaciones de género, lo cual no hace tan sencillo, ¿no? Y la historia de la India, lo que nos acaba de contar la doctora Sinha, y como sabemos bien la nuestra, da cuenta que no es tan sencillo modificar ciertos esquemas de género, mucho menos a nivel legal. Entonces, no obstante, sí creo que entender un contexto histórico específico o los procesos de una sociedad exige atravesar por muchas categorías el análisis y entre ellas el género, el cual a su vez se alimenta de las otras categorías y alimenta las otras categorías, y eso permite la legitimación y la consolidación tanto de las relaciones de género, me parece, como en este caso del Estado o del elemento que estemos estudiando. Y en este sentido me parece que es algo en lo que hay que trabajar mucho, al menos como historiadores, y es en rescatar la agencia de las mujeres. Es decir, no importa si es en el ámbito privado, no importa si es una loca que está en la Castañeda, no importa si es una criminal que ha sido procesada, o no importa si es una feminista que está en las calles buscando el sufragio, todas con su accionar y con su actuar, partiendo de que están en un contexto generizado, por decirlo de alguna manera, participan, activan y modifican, en estricto sentido, la formación de ese Estado. Porque finalmente lo que ellas hacen o dejan de hacer, lo hacen en función de las relaciones de género existentes, las cuales a su vez están atravesadas por cuestiones económicas, ideológicas, políticas, etcétera, etcétera. Y la forma en la que actúan inevitablemente va a ir modificando las normativas oficiales, las formas de control oficial, las leyes, los discursos psiquiátricos, por ejemplo. Entonces creo que un punto de partida fundamental es precisamente lo social, es decir, buscar la forma en la que la actividad de las mujeres construye su propia identidad, como estaba aquí platicando con nosotros la doctora Sinha con respecto al feminismo. O sea, ese feminismo, cómo se está construyendo, desde dónde se está alimentando, qué es lo que está proponiendo y qué es lo que está buscando, eso está muy bien, pero dar cuenta de cómo este feminismo se va moviendo y va asumiendo posturas, va a afectar inevitablemente, ¿no?, las posibilidades de las mujeres o la idea del ser mujer en la India posteriori. Y de ahí, digo, nada prácticamente la historia de la India, pero está la ley Sarda, es así, que tiene muy poca vida, pero que finalmente esta idea de ponerle límite a los matrimonios, vinculado con este feminismo nacionalista, me parece fundamental entenderlo a la luz de la agencia de las propias mujeres que están asumiendo algo, pero dar cuenta precisamente que hay un ámbito mucho más complejo de género también que no va a permitir que sea tan sencillo, porque hay una nación que está construida sobre determinadas relaciones de género, más allá de esos discursos que se están apropiando. Pero bueno, para concluir, me parece sumamente atractiva la propuesta de la doctora Sinha y relevante, y sobre partir de la agencia de los sujetos y repensar una categoría de género mucho más expandida, mucho más amplia y que salga de lo binario, porque si no vamos a seguir haciendo una historia muy binaria y muy trunca y vamos a dejar de dar cuenta que desde el lugar en donde sea que estén nuestros sujetos históricos mujeres, están haciendo historia y están participando en los procesos históricos y están afectando las instituciones políticas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por la invitación. Me pareció muy interesante la conferencia. Es un honor para mí también compartir esta mesa. Bueno, me gustaría brevemente retomar algunas ideas que considero relevantes, originales de la conferencia y reflexionar sobre ellas. Bueno, lo primero, coincido completamente en la necesidad de ampliar la academia, de ampliar los ámbitos de estudio, de salir de los ámbitos locales y de la riqueza que implica una historia comparada, comparativa. También, coincido completamente en esta cuestión de que el género social es mucho más amplio y, por supuesto, mucho más cambiante que el sexo biológico. Me parece muy interesante este interés por vincular o localizar los puntos de encuentro entre el nacionalismo anticolonial, en el caso de la India, el nacionalismo en general, los proyectos nacionales, los proyectos de nación, los proyectos políticos y el movimiento feminista, en este caso el movimiento feminista temprano en la India, pero en general las demandas de las mujeres o los movimientos feministas. Creo también que resulta muy interesante esta diferencia al acercarse a los nacionalismos, esta diferencia en dos posibilidades de acercamiento. Por una parte, buscar la contribución de las mujeres o cómo la demanda feminista contribuyó, en cierta forma, coincidió o se diferenció de la demanda de grupos nacionalistas, y por otra parte, leer el movimiento nacionalista a partir de preocupaciones de género, buscando la óptica de género dentro de la propuesta de nación de los grupos que estaban luchando en un momento dado por reivindicar una nación o por un movimiento de independencia. Efectivamente, y en esto también coincido, no se pueden separar dos campos, lo social, lo político, lo privado, lo público. Esta separación era imposible en ese momento y resulta imposible porque finalmente un movimiento nacionalista imagina una nación, y una nación parte de supuestos tan esenciales como quién es un ciudadano, quién vota, la igualdad o la diferencia. Son elementos de una agenda política que afectan inevitablemente una agenda social. Y aquí se llega, digamos, a un asunto que a mí me ha interesado mucho al acercarme a la historia del derecho. Esta cuestión del pluralismo versus la igualdad. Pluralismo jurídico, reconocimiento de diferencias jurídicas, contra un modelo que apuesta definitivamente por la igualdad entre los individuos. Esto finalmente marca un tránsito histórico sin duda, se parte, digamos, en el caso de Occidente, de un pluralismo normativo, hablo por ejemplo específicamente de la Nueva España, un orden jurídico que reconocía diferencias, de nuevo, de grupos por raza, a la igualdad jurídica por la que apuestan las naciones que optan por un modelo liberal o en teoría por la modernidad política. Ahora, naturalmente, la igualdad tiene muchas ventajas, digo, simplemente preservación y respeto de los mismos derechos sin importancia de origen, de raza, de clase, pero finalmente la igualdad sacrifica pluralismo. Es una igualdad que se imagina a partir de un modelo occidental, modelo de élite, y que se impone sobre diferencias. Un modelo homogéneo que tiene que sacrificar o pasar por alto la heterogeneidad y que finalmente sacrifica la equidad por la igualdad, porque muchas veces la igualdad no deriva en un trato equitativo, sino por el contrario. Y entonces, esta finalmente es una preocupación que está muy presente tanto en la conferencia como en otros estudios de la doctora. Muestra ella claramente, lo mencionó aquí, lo ha tratado antes, cómo finalmente la lucha de las mujeres dentro del movimiento nacionalista, estoy hablando de décadas de 1920 y 1930 en la India, cómo ellas optaban finalmente por la ciudadanía universal, digamos, por esta ciudadanía individual. ¿Por qué? Porque finalmente la vía del reconocimiento de las comunidades obstaculizaba muy probablemente su participación política. Era mucho más difícil que lograran esta vía abierta de participación dentro de comunidades locales que dentro de un proyecto nacional. Y finalmente en otros trabajos que tuve, digamos, a los que me acerqué un poco preparando esta intervención, bueno, plantean finalmente este problema, el reconocimiento de un pluralismo jurídico de tradiciones de comunidades que muchas veces tienen costumbres, leyes que no favorecen a las mujeres, y la necesidad finalmente de buscar la uniformidad en códigos civiles, en leyes nacionales, pero justamente a partir de la óptica del género. Y vuelvo a la idea original. La importancia de ir más allá de los estudios locales. Y vuelvo a ello porque finalmente este es un problema actual y presente en México. Se ha reconocido o se ha respetado el uso usos y costumbres en elecciones en comunidades indígenas. Y muchos de los conflictos que están llegando actualmente a tribunales electorales tienen que ver justamente con este asunto, la segregación de las mujeres por parte de las comunidades que finalmente están actuando con usos y costumbres que están firmemente no favoreciendo la participación, el voto y la representación política. Entonces, bueno, me parece todos estos problemas muy interesantes, muy actuales y que finalmente no solamente atañen a una nación. Bueno, un poco volviendo a esto, la cuestión de los retos, esta cuestión entre encontrar equilibrios entre la igualdad, la defensa de derechos, la defensa de los derechos de las mujeres y a la vez la posible preservación de diferencias, el respeto a la heterogeneidad. Y hablaba la doctora de retos y a la vez avances de la academia. Por una parte, reconocer la importancia política, el carácter público del asunto de género, de acuerdo completamente. Por otra parte, otra cuestión importante, incorporar el estudio de género, incorporar a los estudios de género el análisis del género masculino. Ver a los hombres como sujetos de género, no solamente a las mujeres. Y finalmente, la última, cómo todo esto puede ayudar a terminar con la masculinización y en general con esta concepción binaria, tanto en conceptos como en papeles y tareas asignados a nivel de la nación, del imaginario, de la familia o de la vida cotidiana. Gracias.
Vamos a abrir una ronda de preguntas, así que tienen la palabra. Doctora Ordorica, primero, aquí adelante después. Ishita.
Te quiero agradecer muchísimo la conferencia, fue muy interesante. Quería mencionar lo que mencionó la doctora Speckman. Me resultó cuando te leí muy interesante esta idea de que hay que pensar la masculinidad, porque yo también estaba sobre la noción de que si todo era construido por varones, la masculinidad estaba ya pensada de alguna manera, y me resultó muy sugerente la idea de que no, que en realidad no se han pensado como sujetos de género. Me gustaría que hablaras más de eso, pero también me gustaría que hablaras de cómo estas teorías, a pesar de su carácter muy marginal dentro de las propias academias, por ser teorías desde la perspectiva de género, desde el feminismo, han sido capaces de desestabilizar narraciones hegemónicas sobre la modernidad, sobre los procesos muy explicados desde el primer mundo, de cómo han sido los procesos de colonización, y han mostrado que se genera una academia y un pensamiento que no solo es un pensamiento de recepción de teorías generadas desde los centros, sino que las periferias están generando nuevos tipos de conocimiento que desestabilizan y podrían aportar y podrían cambiar incluso las narrativas sobre el nacionalismo, pero si bien son muy interesantes, no dejamos de tener este lugar muy, muy periférico, los trabajos feministas, o sea, ni siquiera en nuestros propios países tenemos un lugar donde se nos considera lo suficientemente interesantes como para dialogar. Entonces son desestabilizaciones que se quedan como también muy, muy encerradas en su propio discurso, o si tú ves que han efectivamente, por lo menos en el caso del nacionalismo, irrumpido en las grandes narraciones o en autores que no son propiamente autores que utilizan perspectivas de género o feministas.
Okay, gracias. Aquí adelante. Sí, aquí en la primera fila.
Hola, gracias. Yo quería, primero agradecer la conferencia, las intervenciones posteriores, me han gustado mucho. Quería comentar, leí algún trabajo académico que señalaban como los procesos de modernización son los que ponen en riesgo, ¿no?, la identidad cultural, se siente así, y cómo se aprovecha dentro del proceso de modernización la separación de la esfera de lo público y lo privado para construir esa identidad de género de la mujer en lo privado, dentro como salvaguarda, como guardiana de la identidad cultural. Entonces, pues quería conocer un poco su opinión al respecto.
Gracias. La doctora Ishita.
Thanks, Minnie, again for a very suggestive and provocative talk. Perdón, voy a hablar en inglés para que si ella me puede entender sin por medio de sí. Sorry. Two brief things. One, your point about the gradual privatization of the family is very well taken. It made me think. I hadn't thought of it that way. So how do you open it up even more to really do away with the idea of the private family? You know, I think that's the challenge we need to take up, rather than, as you said, you know, that the domestic and the political are two separate entities that come into dialogue, but you hang on to that division of the domestic and the political. So how do you make the domestic completely political and not retain its domesticity? No? So that is one point. The other one is a very minor one. How do you react to Padma Annagol's work, who is challenging this, you know, the use of women as symbols, and she's saying, let's look at what the women did, right?
Okay. Atrás el profesor Sanjay.
I actually wanted to raise the question which has often puzzled me, you know, and it comes back to Ishita's question as well, of the lack of studies of the relationship, for instance, of between gender and entrepreneurship. Because you know that, I mean, now with all this globalization talk, which everybody and his brother seems to do, I mean, one of the very interesting questions is, for instance, if you look at some of the largest of these families, say top 100 or 120 entrepreneurial families in India, they have very, very curious gender relations. And the transmission of property, the divisions, the feuds and disputes, all of this are very, very gendered. But it doesn't seem to be a subject which anybody is very interested in studying, and I was wondering why.
Okay. Bueno.
Okay. Lisa and Marta, thank you very much for those comments. I really appreciate it, and I hope I could do justice to all the things that you pointed out. But, but two things that I take away from both those comments that were really so useful. I mean, I think your reminder of not thinking of women as only in opposition to men is certainly something I wanted to emphasize as well, and I really think you kind of brought that point out really well in thinking about your own work as well. And I think that has been a problem with earlier ways of thinking about women and gender. And Elisa, I think thinking about the ways in which custom of particular indigenous communities and then rights of women conflict, I think is a wonderful comparison with the Indian case. And I, in my own work, argue that it is that particular way in which women get constructed as outside of community that becomes responsible for this constant pitting of these two things. But I think it's a wonderful reminder that instead of taking the idea of woman as given before, if we really focus on how woman comes into being, it would be a much more useful way of getting at it. So thank you. And Teresa, I'm not sure whether I get these points kind of addressing yours completely. I think that there was a little bit of static, and so I may have missed something. So if I misunderstood it, just correct me about that. I mean, first, the point that you were making about masculinity. I think you're right that just like scholars of race took to studying whiteness much after they studied blackness. I mean, race was always the name for non-white people, and the next move was to kind of see that white is a race as well, right? And the same thing in India when you're thinking about caste. I mean, caste scholarship has predominantly been the burden of the people who are lower caste or untouchable, rather than study of, you know, Brahmin or other upper caste cultures. So I think that has been the question that feminist scholars have for long debated, the question of what becomes visible and what is invisible invisible, that, power often operates through a certain invisibility. So the gender of men is invisible. I mean, and so it was a very productive move to kind of make that turn. I guess what I was wanting to say, and I may not be answering your question in this, is that what that move often did is that it made gender scholarship became a scholarship that was much more interesting because it was about these new topics, men and masculinity. We'd all done women and tired, and that was boring, and that was flat, and men and masculinity was new. And I think the dilemma with that was that actually we forgot to bring some of those same critical analysis to women. So the number of people who already know, I'm going to study women in this country. It would be a very interesting question that a Nigerian scholar working on the Yoruba in the early colonial period asked in her book. She asked this question, but how do you know there are women in that society? Right? So the question is, if you already know there are women, you're going to go study women, and that's why women became such a boring category. But if you open up that category and say, are there women in that society, and when did this category women emerge in that society, you get a very different kind of question. And I think that's where I was thinking that maybe to really make that shift, we need, as scholars, to go back to that discarded, boring category, women, and really see when women happens. When does woman happen? And I think that's connected to Ishita's point a little, so I'm going to address that and then come back to you. Because Ishita, your point about the the family, the creation of the family, I think one of the most exciting things that feminist scholarship has contributed to gender and nationalism, but not always taken up by scholars who cite Partha Chatterjee as the example of gender and nationalism, is that Partha Chatterjee already takes the division between the domestic and the public as given. So he takes it as natural that women will be in the home. But the more interesting and much longer scholarship has been precisely to show that, look, even in the classic 19th century period, the domestic was not really so domestic. There were Marwari families, there were other families in India where the household was where, and to get back to Sanjay's point, entrepreneurship and all of that happened. So when you ask the question of why we don't look at it, I think we don't look at it because our categories are already so divided that people who do business history or economic history often neglect to see the gender domain of these families. People who do gender history often tend to think that ought to be the focus of that ought to be women's position, women's situation. And that creates this kind of, the paradox that I started out with is this ghettoization of feminist scholarship. So we all pay lip service, gender, race, and class. We do gender, race, and class. But it is still in its, proper domains. We don't trouble that. And I think if we were to trouble more of that, we may even want to see that, there may be women, there's gender operating in those business families, but is it creating women? Or is it creating something else, a different kind of figure? So is a woman always a woman? Or are there times when a woman is an entrepreneur and, she's not a woman, physically whatever she may be, but she's an entrepreneur. So those are the questions we need to be asking. And the last point that you made, Teresa, and I may be completely misunderstanding, so correct me if I'm wrong, this question about thinking of how the categories of knowledge that we produce are not necessarily first world imports into third world scholarship. I think that challenge in a way is not really new in the sense that if you think of the whole, in the South Asian context, the whole attempt of, say, people like the famous subaltern studies group, or if you take in the Latin American context, the people who were doing the dependentista school, even before that, one of the aims of that scholarship was to say, hey, wait a minute, that traditional divide between the dual economy, agricultural and business is not, and industry is not, doesn't look the same in the third world. Or the subalterns saying that, the categories of analysis of Europe cannot be transported into the third world. I think that was an initial interesting first move. But I think where it's limited, and which is why I started with Kumari Jayawardena's book, is where it's limited is that it basically then makes an argument for the difference of Mexico or Latin America or South Asia or India. But what I'm saying, and what Jayawardena's book was useful for me in opening up, is that they're not saying we are different because we deal with nation and you don't, but in a way it's saying that when feminist scholars in India started recognizing, or in South Asia started recognizing nationalism was a major concern, it forced European scholars and American scholars to say, hey, we had kind of thought nationalism does not exist for us, but maybe we need to pay attention to it. So it became not an argument for a third world difference, but it became an argument to say that that's an important intervention in scholarship wherever, but it's coming out of our particular history. So when I'm saying I would like to see us go back to thinking about women not as an a priori category, I'm arguing in a way that it's relevant not just in Nigeria among the Yoruba or South Asia, but maybe even in the US or in Europe. We want to take that same idea that's coming out of scholarship here to open it up and say, when did women get created in US society? I mean, at what point? Was it in colonial, antebellum? You know, when did that happen? So that's where I'd go. With your point, and last point, and on with that, I think, and if I haven't answered, please forgive me, and I'd be happy to return to that. With your point, Ishita, about Anagol, Padma Anagol's work, I think a lot of work, I mean, I think her work is wonderful in thinking about the emergence of feminism, but a lot of other work also, Suruchi Thapar, Bokat, you know, who've kind of looked at women's agency. I think where I would want to push them further is that it still is that agency in not creating something or not questioning some of the categories of new things that they're creating. Because what these people are doing is they're creating their feminism. But what I would want to push, and especially if you were to buy my argument that the Karachi Resolution of 1931 came not from M.N. Roy, but came from Muthulakshmi Reddy and Mridula Sarabhai and Kamala Chattopadhyay, then you'd be saying in a way that these women's agency is rethinking how India imagined the very category of citizen. So then tomorrow, if you're studying citizenship, you cannot say, which is what often happens in the historiography, is people feel quite comfortable in saying, I study political history, but I don't do women, right? And you don't do women, I mean, it would be quite unthinkable if you say, I don't do men. But you can say, I don't do women, which is half the population, because you assume that they did not have anything to say to notions of democracy or citizenship. They only, you know, practitioners of it.
Bueno, muchas gracias a la doctora Sinha por su conferencia y a las dos comentaristas, a la doctora Marta, la doctora Elisa, muchas gracias. Y vamos a hacer un breve receso de 10 minutos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Thank you. I'm sure I did answer your questions, but I hope. Oh.
Nos acabamos. Sí, sí.
I don't know
yeah, I did.
What my point is that something else that she's constantly. Yeah. And my point is that so it's got a very because she becomes the author of the so I like that. Well, I love the project because it's about but what I found interesting is that I never find bibliography that dealt with oh really? Yeah, what I mean is I live in India so I knew how horrible the situation is. But I could never find like something that said, yeah, I found something that it was just many I will give you some recommendations if you want. It's a very nice book on